So, thank you very much for this invitation. I really like the idea that this discussion on commons is being developed through various networks, that is, through forms that are suitable for the process that corresponds to commoning. And allow me to share some thoughts with you in the process of trying to enter a discussion that is obviously a discussion that has conflicting points of view. I don't believe that the discussion on commons is simply a discussion on a very specific topic on which we all agree. It's rather a process through which we keep on defining the terms, keep on defining the points of view, and take insights if you want. So my way of entering this discussion is putting an emphasis rather on the politics of commoning and not on the economy of commoning. This, of course, makes it more suitable in the context of your discussions and your workshops in this summer school. But also, I think is already a form of taking sides in an ongoing dispute, an ongoing debate about the meaning of commons. So I would, first of all, attempt to enter this discussion by trying to understand what a community might be in the context of the discussion of commoning. I start with Rancière's understanding of politics, which I think is a really helpful understanding in the context of our discussion on commons, because he conceives politics as a polemic over the common. Indeed, the community is based on this polemic over the common. And when this polemic over the common, which I will try shortly to describe how I understand it, is not taking place, is kind of stopped, then Rancière thinks that community, society in general, evolves to a kind of police order. Yes, probably the term is a bit too exaggerated as a term, but indeed tries to mark the difference between politics as a movement, as a process of movement, the continuous dispute over what it is that we should consider as common, as opposed to a society which is kind of ossified, fossilized, does not breathe, does not change, does not transform itself, and ends up being a kind of fixed order. So I think if we combine this idea with the idea coming from a theorist from Uruguay, from Latin America, who believes that indeed a community is a process and not a stable arrangement of relations that keeps on repeating itself, then we end up understanding indeed community as a process through which a common world is created. A common world can be, of course, an enclosed common world, that is a world that we are forced to share, that we are forced to participate, and in this way we are forced to agree with the major presuppositions that are supporting this common world, or, and I would tend to support this understanding of the common world, or a common world can be a process. A common world as a process may correspond to a community as a process, to a community as a process which is being developed through various forms of polemic over the common. And I would, in this conceptualization of community, I would connect an understanding of commons and commoning indeed, again, as a process that does not simply try to establish certain forms of sharing or certain items, products, things to be shared, but indeed a process through which what is to be considered as common is to be redefined. It's a dynamic process. That's why I try to integrate to this to this understanding of commons two contributions. The one is probably you know, most of you, the definition by David Harvey, which is a bit complicated, but what it says in the end is that it's more, commons is not a thing, but a relation, okay? It's a relation which is, I would add, which is performed. It happens. It takes place in a certain context, a social context. I would try to compare this understanding of commons, the definition of a common word, which is a process, which is based on the creation and the dispute about social relations, with the idea of comunalidad, which is an idea that comes actually from Latin America also. It is a made term, and it's probably made mostly by people who were, by scholars who were involved with indigenous thought. And they try to express with this word not the fact that we have something in common, comunalidad. Commonality is being translated usually in English, but it's not easily a good translation. I believe that it leaves a lot out. Huh? Comunalidad is, as Esteva tries to say, the juxtaposition of commons and polity. It is a process that defines its stakes and also takes place. Okay? So, from that, from the comparison between the idea that commons is a relation which is being performed, and also community is a process through which stakes are being defined and a polemic over the common develops, I end up thinking about commons, trying to use mostly commoning rather than commons as a thing, or commons as an area of investigation. If commoning is to be a process, because in commoning, not only what is at stake in sharing is being defined, but also a community that defines itself through commoning, then commoning is indeed a dynamic process that could possibly lead to a transgression, to a kind of after, a beyond existing capitalist societies, and I would try to explore a bit this possibility. To connect this to the city, if the city is not simply an arrangement of places, okay, if the city is not simply an order, a spatial order, but indeed the city also is a space of possibilities, or if you want, is a performed space, a space which happens because people are being related to each other, then urban commoning might be a kind of commoning, an aspect of commoning perhaps, which, at least as I understand it, should not only be connected to things that happen or exist in the city, or to resources connected with the urban environment, but perhaps urban commoning has to do with urban space both as a medium and as a stake. Okay? Urban space can be indeed a form of shared thing, a kind of commons, but what distinguishes, I think, urban space from other kinds of commons is the fact that urban space is also a shaping factor of processes of commoning. So this is how I would try to, oops, I did something wrong. No? This is why I will try to connect this discussion to the idea of institutions. Let's remember, community as a polemic over the common, a process through which the common is being defined. What is the role of institutions? What do we mean by institutions? Allow me to take a definition or an understanding of institution that does not come from political theory, but rather from anthropology, which means that institutions are not simply forms that are reproducing existing relations of power, but perhaps in a more general sense are tools, social tools, through which a repeatability of actions, a predictability of actions is being implemented. If we take this rather broad definition, which of course includes relations of power, but it's more than that, then it is important to see how institutions can be connected to processes of commoning. Is commoning establishing itself through forms of repeatability? And what kinds of forms of repeatability can go along with an ongoing process of definition of the commons? What kinds of form of repeatability can go along with a polemic over the common? It seems to be a kind of contradiction, okay? But, come on, I'm just used to another kind of computer and pressing the wrong buttons. So, I think that we should and can distinguish between two at least different kinds of institutions that can be connected to commoning. According to some definitions that have to do with the well-known understanding of commons by hard and angry and relevant thinkers, as Gigi Rogero, there are institutions that is forms of repeatability, forms of definition of reproduction of acts and meanings, through which indeed the common is being corrupted. That's the term they use. That is, at least to my understanding, these are forms through which the common loses its meaning, is being transformed perhaps to its opposite. And how is commons, or how is commoning as a process can be transformed to its opposite? If it is directed not to a condition through which people share things and define what is to be shared, but rather to a condition through which certain people define for all the others what is to be shared, under what conditions, and enclose the process, that is, define the limits of this process. And indeed, this kind of institutions corresponds to the city as an agglomeration of enclaves. You probably are well familiar with this discussion. Today's cities are more like forms of relations that define a kind of order which is not the order of the city of zones, or the fantasized order of the city of zones, to be more accurate, but it's rather the peculiar and sometimes not easily traceable order of the city of enclaves, that is self-defining and self-enclosing areas in which certain procedures are being performed, certain acts are being permitted, certain behaviors are being encouraged. So the city of enclaves indeed produces institutions that corrupt the common, because it tends to enclose in those enclaves areas of potential sharing, but in which those who participate in the sharing are not allowed most of the times to define the rules, are not allowed to question or to challenge the laws. Mostly they are allowed to enter this process of sharing without, however, being able to define the rules, and sometimes what they share is probably their misery or their idea of being excluded from this enclave. So we know these are very well-known pictures. Just to remind you, a gated community is an enclave, an urban enclave that can be considered as an area in which the commons is being corrupted. Okay? In a gated community, commoning appears to be a process through which certain inhabitants share certain facilities, also may share certain processes. There are, in many cases, a kind of imitation of the very process through which people participate in taking decisions, but in the end they do not take decisions. They simply participate in a simulation of participatory democracy. Most of the times they simply share some facilities, and a board of managers takes most of the decisions. So this is a corrupted area of commoning. However, we can learn from aspects of urban commoning which indeed happen in our cities, and try to understand if there are possibilities of urban commoning, inherent possibilities in urban commoning that can go beyond existing domination and existing capitalist relations. And I would briefly say that we have at least two areas in which we can find institutions of commoning that tend to be open, that is not corrupted. First, this is the area of everyday survival. We live in cities, these are from Athens, but it could be from many places of the world. We live in cities in which various populations, various cultures, various kinds of people who sometimes are chased from their places. They didn't choose to leave their place. They were forced to leave their places. And so they were kind of forced to organize their own common spaces, that is shared spaces, in a hostile environment. Sometimes this kind of common space tends to look like an enclave space, that is, an enclave of not exactly misery, but attempting to protect their own minimum standards of common life in a hostile environment. But some other times, and I think these are cases in which common or shared spaces are being used in ways that transcend the barriers or the frontiers or the boundaries that are being shaped around them. They kind of create porous perimeters through which they overspill the barriers that are being erected around them, so they do not become forms of self-ghettoized experiences. In those cases, we tend to see forms through which people, actually the users of space, tend to participate in the processes through which space is being defined, and to participate also in the rules being shaped in those spaces. Obviously, I would not have the time to discuss in detail each one of these images, but just they are there to show you that those kinds of traces can be more or less ephemeral. They can be formed in most of the pictures before were from Athens, but the one above is from Barcelona, obviously, for those who know Barcelona, is the Macua. So you have places in which, even in temporary appropriations, you have a community which is emergent, is not very well established, it's becoming, it exists in a process of defining itself and defining its space as shared space. And in those cases, I think what we might call forms of repeatability or institutions indeed develop ad hoc and in a process of being defined by those who participate in space. These are images from Havana, Cuba. I think this is also a very interesting space in which informal practices of public space appropriation, it did develop interesting areas of commoning that are being formed. It's more like a chain of actions, a chain of initiatives that happen on a network of spaces which define the waterfront of the city. So, what kind of institutions would be those that sustain and expand commoning? I would say that we can at least find three important characteristics of those institutions, if those institutions are meant to sustain and expand commoning, that is, fight against its possible enclosure. Because I think, to say it in one word, whatever process tends to define commons or commoning as a process which is closed and refers to a very specific and stable community will end up eventually in destroying commoning, will end up eventually in reversing the meaning of commoning. So I would say to describe at least three of the characteristics of those institutions. First of all, those institutions should be forms through which repeatability establishes kinds of comparability. The possibility of being with others and comparing what you want and what they want. Comparability is like not simply tolerating difference, but making difference relevant. So if we are in a process through which a common word is defined not simply as a homogeneous area in which people who share exactly the same values and the same habits participate, but a common word may be defined as a process through which people enter, newcomers in Rancière's terms, enter this common word and become co-producers of the characteristics of this common word, then this word should give them the opportunity to compare. And what's more than that, to translate. Translation is not, as we know from literature, very accurate science or whatever, very accurate practice. It always needs to readjust. It's never finished, but it means to establish a correspondence. It doesn't abandon this scope. So translation is actually a process through which people may be discovered in the process of co-producing a common word, the fact that they can be different, however, equally members of this common world, okay? So let us not try to understand the common world and the practices of commoning as practices and things, sorry, not things, ideas through which we understand the common as what we share as a common identity. No, the common is more than that, is a process through which we establish comparisons, translations, and indeed we discover forms through which the ultimate sharing should be established. And I think the ultimate form of sharing is the sharing of power. It is on that form of sharing that the meaning of sharing should be based. If we don't, in a process of commoning, in the process of creating a common world, establish tools, artifices of equality, as Rachel says, that are being mechanisms through which we try to avoid, try to discourage, try to prohibit, try to fight against the creation, the accumulation of power. If we don't create, if we don't invent these kind of artifices of equality, then any form of sharing will tend to reverse itself to enclosure. Either an enclosure of an elitist group or an enclosure of a group that shares lots of its bad conditions, but not lots of its potentiality of transcending those conditions. A ghetto, if you want. So, in this process, I would introduce the idea of thresholds as the spatiality which corresponds to these institutions, to these forms of commoning that are being always open to newcomers and introduce forms of comparability, repeatability, and sharing of power. If enclave spatiality corresponds to the enclosure of commons, I think that threshold spatiality, that is a spatiality of comparisons. What is a threshold? It's an area in between. It gives you the possibility to compare an inside and an outside, to compare adjacent areas, to compare adjacent behaviors, practices. Huh? A threshold-like situation is a situation which is in between, and it creates the possibility of comparison. So I think threshold spatiality would rather correspond to the idea of an expanding commoning and to the institutions that correspond to forms of expanding commoning, that is commoning that is always alive, always overspilling the boundaries of a certain society, community. A few images as examples. This, as you read, is a self-constructed settlement in São Paulo. What is a distinguishing characteristic of this settlement, which is not as one more favela, but it is indeed a result of the practices of a certain group of homeless people which is organized politically, is producing its own common space, its own common facilities, which are rather poor, as you see. This would be the equivalent of a kindergarten in our societies, but indeed it is a voluntary contribution, and this would be a multi-use area, cultural multi-use area. This is how they have created it. But indeed, it is being also a space which being created through the active participation of those who define the rules of use, of those who extend it beyond the borders of a certain enclave spatiality. Okay? And it is also a process through which people keep on defining what is to be shared. Another example from Buenos Aires also is this is a voluntary work in a favela in Buenos Aires, in Villa 31, as they call it, where people actually participate in creating common facilities, but they are not in a way of the philanthropic contribution, which means we come from outside, we give you something that we need, that you need. No, this is a process through which continuous negotiations define what is to be shared, what this community needs, but how it can connect to various other needs. And I think the most important need of those areas in Buenos Aires and in many other enclaves of poor is the need to connect to the city. They want to be part of the city. And maybe resonances of the discussion on the right to the city can come to this discussion. Indeed, to participate in the city is to be able to define the city, as Lefebvre said. It's not simply to participate in certain assets connected to the city or services connected to the city. As you probably remember, Lefebvre was talking about the city as an oeuvre, as a work of art. Okay? So the ultimate expression of the right to the city is the possibility of defining the city, of creating the city collectively. So this is also a modest idea of the right to the city, but a very brave one, if you want, if you see the conditions. And also, of course, most of the times it ends with collective eating. I will bypass this example and finish with my idea about what can we learn about the recent Squares movement, Indignados movement, and Occupy movement as a form of extending processes and experimental forms of urban commoning. I think the fact that these processes were connected to a very extensive and actual, I will describe the word, I will define the word actual in a moment, an actual discussion about the meaning of democracy, gives to the discussion of commoning a very important aspect. So in the Squares, I think what was invented again was indeed the process through which commoning can become an open set of practices that defines its own rules. And the meaning of democracy was indeed that. To discover radical democracy would mean to discover the forms of participation that can end up in institutions, the way, of course, that I have tried to discover the word institutions. So I would tend to see in Syntagma Square occupation, for example, in which I was lucky to be part of, I would tend to see that those practices were indeed inventing themselves, not simply as forms of doing things, but as forms of establishing repeatability. It's a media center, but also a dance. It's a form of cleaning the square, but also a form of coordinating bodies. What is, in the end, democracy? Is democracy simply the creation of a common world through an exchange of opinions, which are supposed to be equal, and so on and so forth? No, probably it is more than that. It's a set of practices that tend to support these exchanges, and it is also a discussion on forms through which those practices are meant to be regulated, are meant to be coordinated, are meant to be processes through which what is to be shared is constantly under definition. Just to remind you, the same things happen in Spain, in the Indignados movement, in Tahrir, and of course, we are in Gezi, and we know that this was a very important experience also in Istanbul. To finish here, I would suggest that the idea of threshold commons could be helpful in trying to understand or to distinguish the forms through which we understand urban commoning as an open process. If urban commoning is not simply a form of defining urban space as something to be shared, but explicitly gets involved in using space as a shaping factor of institutions of commoning. So if urban commoning does not refer to space as a thing, but also to space as a medium, as a shaping factor, then perhaps this urban commoning indeed has the characteristic of threshold in all three levels. The first level is the kind of spaces it produces. If we call common space as quite distinct, we might have the opportunity to discuss the distinction between common space and public space. I did not kind of dwell on that, but I can return to this discussion if it's important, if you think it's important. So, threshold space, common space is threshold space. On the second level, institutions are of a threshold character, that is, they are always being shaped through processes of negotiation in which comparability and translatability indeed take specific form, are being performed. And the third level, if you want, is the fact that the very subjects who participate in those processes tend to become threshold entities. Not, of course, in the way that Victor Turner or other anthropologists describe those who are members of an initiative process, in the process of, not initiative process, wrong word, in the process of initiation, like coming from childhood to adolescence. You are a threshold figure because you are not yet adolescent, but you are not anymore a child. But let's try to think about this kind of threshold quality of subjectivity, this kind of threshold quality of identity. If people can become what they are meant to be, but through a process in which they are actively contributing to that, or if people can even defy what they are meant to be. So in defining this common word, they are actively participating in the process of describing and creating their own identities, then perhaps what in the end a social or a political identity is something that happens through constant negotiations in the process of open and expanding commoning. Let's try to understand this process as an open process, even on the level of identities, and it is indeed something that we have seen in the squares. People were not simply taking their identities to the square. If you see a teacher who wants to contribute to a common initiative in helping immigrant children to learn the language of the host, so-called host country, then this guy is not simply a teacher anymore. If you see a doctor who tries to be part of a self-managed medical center, especially in cases in which you have to take care of victims of police aggression, then you are not simply a doctor. You are changing, by contributing to this process, you are even changing your identity. You are challenging the stability of this identity. And I think we can say that this is indeed a threshold identity too. So to sum up, I think that we need to understand commoning as a process which is being developed through threshold qualities of space, threshold qualities of institutions, and threshold qualities of identity. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take a couple of questions for clarifications, but I invite you again to write down the more explorative, the more deep questions that might have come up from the lecture, and we'll come back to them after the coffee break. So now just a few questions on what Stavros has talked about, clarifications, doubts.
Thanks for the presentation. You presented mostly work related to urban commoning. Mm-hmm. Can you just very quickly say if there is a lot of work on rural commoning, or what can you tell us about that? Thanks.
Well, I don't feel that I am very well informed about the processes of rural commoning. I tend to think that even in rural commoning, however, we need to develop equally institutions, subjectivities, and forms of negotiation that are being always including newcomers. And that I would think that it is a very important characteristic of any kind of commoning. But I'm not sure if how this idea of urban space as a shared medium and a shaping factor applies exactly to the understanding of rural commons. One thing I would also attempt to support is that indeed we need to take this discussion out of a kind of essentialism that connects connects rural commons to specific identifiable resources or things. It's even, I don't know if it looks a bit too much to say that even water does not exist out there. It becomes a stake of urban commoning, of commoning in general, sorry. It becomes a stake as long as we define it socially. So water is not an entity, is not a chemical compound, obviously. It's something that we need for something. And describing the rules through which we should regulate the use of this that we need, and the forms through which we can define it as socially meaningful product, is indeed a process through which water becomes a social construction. For example, if you see a fountain in the middle of a large villa in Tunis or in Morocco, you know very well that this water, which is being wasted in a way, is a definition of a social condition, is a definition of a hegemonic role of this person who has the power to throw water or to expose the power to use water. Huh? So water is indeed. But I deeply respect all those discussions having to do with rural commons. I'm not part of those discussions, however.
Maybe the question that you raised yourself, the difference between public and commons, either now or we could do it later also. But I was curious to know how you separate them.
Yes, I was thinking that this discussion might be more interesting in the context of the workshop that we have later, because it's one of the questions that has been addressed, but we can open it, of course. Just to say it in a few words, I believe that the difference between public space and common space is the fact that public space is the product of a certain authority which authorizes the use of this space under certain rules, under certain conditions, and allows people to use this space by keeping the role of a guarantor of this use. This authority can be more or less democratic. It can be despotic, it can be anything. But it still remains an authority which is absolutely distinguishable from those who use the space. Common space, on the other side, is a space which is being developed by those who are meant to be the users. And the rules are not, do not pre-exist or are not imposed by an outsider who, of course, might guarantee the right use of space. The rules in common space are a matter of negotiations, and especially between those who enter common space. And at least to my understanding of common space, I would add the important ingredient of openness, of expandability. Common space is not really absolutely definable within certain boundaries. It tends to become always open, tends to overfill the boundaries of being imposed or being created by those who use it. That is what happened to the areas of Gezi, to the areas of Porta del Sol, to the areas of Syntagma Square. This was not, it was mostly the attacking forces of police that were trying to convert this open space to an enclave. So the need to fight back the attacking police forces sometimes has enclosed this kind of common space. But the actual texture of this kind of space was to go beyond its own boundaries, I think. So this is my idea of difference.
Hello, thank you very much for your contribution. I was very excited to see that somebody is using Rancière to start the discussion about commoning. A big fan of Rancière. But I want to ask you about, because I had the same feeling that his definition of politics as dissensus and what we have in common is fantastic. But then reading more and thinking more, I realized that, okay, first of all, he's not referring to what we have in common as, you said, resources of things or things. It's about processes as well. But we are tempted to see what we have in common as how we socially define, let's say, the use of certain resources. But in the end, we kind of are drawn back to things and what we share. while my reading of Rancière was very much connected, and this is where I want to ask you if you are using his definition of politics, aesthetic politics, as distribution of the sensible world. So for him, what we have in common is a redistribution. I mean, it's always about redistributing the sensible world. And this sensible world is not just about affective politics or emotion. So he's trying to develop much more about that. And I have trouble in putting that into words in my writing. I wonder if you are writing about this and how.
There are many other aspects of Rancière's theory that can be integrated in the discussion of commons or commoning. And you are very, very accurate and very right. He is indeed suggesting that the process through which the redefinition of the common world is a process of a redefinition of the distribution of the sensible, which is what can be talked about, what can be understood, what can be visualized. Okay. And I think this is a very important contribution because it is a step further from the analysis of ideology. Ideology more or less stays on the fact that we are dominated by dominant ideas. And he says, no, we are dominated by dominant forms of understanding, and even we are so dominated that we cannot think otherwise sometimes. I'm not sure that I follow his kind of deterministic approach on this level. I think, for example, he's always against any kind of consensus, and he talks about dissensus. I think that what we have learned from the squares is that it's not a matter of avoiding consensus, it's a matter of how we build forms of an agreement. For example, if in agreement we're not simply voters, but we might see that, okay, more or less most of you have this opinion. Okay, I will step back. I will not fight to be recognized as a minority because I trust you. We have this process through which we have built the trust in which we can base our next steps. So there are forms of consensus that are not necessarily linked to domination or to police order. And also there are forms of understanding the beyond of the existing distribution of sensible that can happen nevertheless through practices. It's not simply the entering of those who do not have a share, as Rancière says. I tend to use more Godelier's idea on that, who says that, okay, existing prohibitions really exist because we can think of doing what they prohibit. Even the incest taboo exists because people tend to bypass it or to, okay? So if anthropology simply evolves to an understanding of societies as fixed systems which reproduce themselves, and what we put emphasis on is the fixity of those systems, then we might miss all this process through which we discover what can be a possible world, a possible practice, a possible feeling, a possible word. And I think on that we can go beyond the idea of dissensus as a normative suggestion. I think we need to enlarge the idea of consensus as a dynamic understanding of negotiations, which can even include, and I will stop here, which can even include the gift, the idea of gift. Because if you try to discuss in conditions of inequality as if you were equal, then you lose most of it. I mean, let's take the example of someone who participates in an assembly who is an academic, and he is very well intended in contributing to this assembly, which includes neighborhood people who might be workers, civil servants, small entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth. We know that he or she has a very important advantage. He or she knows how to speak, he or she knows how to articulate ideas, and that might be very important power over all the others. So how do we use this? Maybe sometimes we have to shut up, okay, and listen. So this is a form of gift. I offer the fact that I diminish myself in the process of acquiring new possibilities of equality, the process of gift. So consensus can be very, very rich process, And we have learned a lot from the things that happen in the squares, how consensus can indeed be established as a very rich process, and not simply as a process in which agreement is imposed.
Okay, thank you, Stavros, for this. Let's move to the next presentation.
Okay, günaydın. That's the only word I've learned so far in Turkish. So, good morning. I think my presentation is going to flow nicely from Stavros's, especially the last discussion on consensus and issues of the rural commons, which Christo raised. But first, I'd like to thank my hosts. It's great to be here. I'm already feeling at home. The snacks that are laid out during the breaks, the sweets that I've already eaten yesterday, the smelly toilet, all of this reminds me of home. The smelly men's toilet, okay, not, I don't know about the women's. So it's nice to be here, and of course the warmth of the people, most important. A couple of caveats before I start. One is that normally I do this presentation over about an hour. This is going to be half an hour, so there will be some things that I will run through rather quickly and will feel simplistic. And I hope that we can go deeper into those in the discussion. There are some publications that I've put outside for those of you who are interested in reading further. One of the publications on which this presentation is based is a book that a couple of us did a few years back, which I have a couple of copies of here. And in the spirit of non-monetized exchange, if there is somebody who's willing to give me something in return, I'd be happy to give these couple of copies. And finally, of course, I think there are a few of you who've probably seen this presentation, and you're welcome to take a nap, because it's going to be somewhat similar to what you may have seen just a couple of weeks back. Okay. I think normally I also do about 15-20 minutes of the crisis that countries like India are going through. I'm going to skip that and just point to the fact that this is something that probably everybody in this room will agree to, and if not, we can of course have a discussion, which is that the current form of what is called development or growth is a form of violence, both to nature, as you see in the top right hand picture, which is an advertisement by an Indian multinational corporation, and it's a form of violence against communities, peoples, cultures, and taking off again from Stavros's presentation against the commons. So clearly it's something for which we need to change this system. Now, we also need to be aware of the fact that there are a lot of false solutions being presented to us. This is the year in which the United Nations, all the countries of the world are going to be signing a Sustainable Development Goals 15-year or 20-year target, the post-2015 SDGs as they're called. And a lot of that is about the green economy, it's about techno-fixes, financial measures, market mechanisms, compensatory measures, etc., which to my mind, some of them may be interesting and important, but overall they are what I call false solutions, because they don't actually fundamentally challenge the system. Another form of false solution is what I think was brilliantly presented yesterday, which is about how ecology has become a fashion. So you have all these gated communities which are now suddenly green spaces, they're eco-friendly, they're about, waking up with nature and things like that. So I'm not going to get into any of this in detail, but we can in the discussion if we need to. To my mind, there is a need for a very fundamental shift in all spheres of human existence. But then what is that alternative? Is the big question, or what are those alternatives? Fundamentally, how do we shift, and what do we shift to? So that's what my focus is going to be, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about is actually learnings from the grassroots in India, and from the discussions and debates and churning that is happening in a country like India. But I think the resonance of what I'm learning from India is probably global. I mean, I'm sure all of us here can in some way or the other resonate with it, even with differences. Part of the shift to a fundamentally different alternative vision for the future is, of course, resistance. Where dominant political economic structures are imposing themselves on communities or on people, and where people are resisting, including the examples that Stavros gave of the various squares, but also the examples of indigenous people or other local communities resisting mining or dams or ports or industrialization or urbanization, etc., and resisting processes by which so-called democratic societies are actually imposing their economic and political values and cultural values on them, is very much part of the answer. One, because it provides a very important mirror against what is happening in the name of development and progress. And secondly, because it gives us the time to find constructive alternative pathways. But the second crucial part, and this is where I think much more focus is needed by civil society and political society than has been the case so far, is constructing these alternative pathways. And that's what I'm going to give you a few examples from India of different sectors, and then the kind of lessons that we're learning from those examples. Now, anybody here who has eaten Indian food? What? Only 3 or 4? Yay, come on, wake up. Good morning. Yes, so I'm going to do this in the form of a recipe, which has 4 main ingredients. It will later on also have what is most important in Indian food, which is spices. And then we'll see what the dish that's being cooked up is. Okay, there's a small village in central India which has this very interesting slogan, which is about direct democracy. It says we elect the government, or it's our government in Mumbai and Delhi, but in our village we are the government. There's nobody else who will come and govern us. We will be governing, we will be self-governing. Now this is a village called Medhalekha. It's an indigenous village of about 500, 600 residents. And about 30 years back, they decided that all the decisions in the village that will be taken with regard to their lands and the surrounding areas will be taken through the village assembly, which includes all the men, women, and children, and that this will be by consensus. So the point that was just raised by Stavros about consensus, how do you actually reach fair means of consensus? This is a very interesting example of that. One of the things that they do is that all dissent is encouraged. If there's even a single person in the assembly who says, I still do not believe or agree with what you're saying, the discussions will go on, and it might actually get completely reversed. But one of the interesting things that they do is that they set up these study circles, much like we do in our universities. And these study circles, which could be 3 of the villagers or 3 villagers plus some professor from outside or some NGO, whatever, they will look at the issue that is going to come up before the village assembly. They'll put together all the relevant information, both traditional, local, and outside knowledge, and that then goes to the assembly so that it is an informed decision that they're taking. Through all these and other processes, they have taken back what was the commons, but which was enclosed through colonial history in India and then subsequently by independent governments. They have taken control back over all the forests that surround them, which they use, which they have traditionally used and which they depend on. And a couple of years back, they also put all the agricultural land of the community, of individuals, into the commons, so that every square inch of land in this village now is actually part of the commons, and it goes through this assembly decision-making process. Another example is from the cities. I don't have too many examples from cities, but there are a few. And this one is about people in some cities in India saying, why should the budgets of the city be determined by bureaucrats or politicians? Why not by those of us for whom the budgets are meant? So there is a process, a grassroots sub-process of trying to actually influence the budgeting through what is called participatory budgeting. And I would imagine, Stavros, this could be one example of a sort of a recommoning or a commoning of what is otherwise enclosed by the state. And there are many other such similar processes of decentralized decision-making that are being attempted in other cities. Another example that I'll give is from Western India, Rajasthan, a very low rainfall area, where for about a decade there was a process in which 65 villages along one river, so they formed a parliament, and that parliament was supposed to be governing and managing the entire river basin of 400 square kilometers. And so all the decisions relating to that basin, which was not just about, well, it started with the issue of water sharing, because if upstream villages would take away all the water, then the downstream villages will not get it. So a process of looking at what is an equitable sharing of water, which then also led into things like forest conservation, cropping patterns, law and order, and inter-village disputes, and things like that. It's been running into problems of late for various reasons, but for a decade or so this worked. It was a very interesting initiative looking at much larger processes of direct democratic decision making at each village level and then working upwards. Taking some of these examples, this first ingredient to my mind has three very crucial components. The first, of course, is direct democracy, which could be at the level of the urban neighborhood, the village or a cluster of villages, or whatever other even new communities that are being formed, as I think Stavros has very rightly said. The second component of that, of course, is that you cannot have direct face-to-face democracy at larger scale. 1.3 billion Indians obviously can't meet together anywhere to discuss things face-to-face. So you need processes of delegated or representative democracy, but which are moving much beyond what we have right now in terms of being much more accountable to the grassroots level through the direct democracy units. And the example of that cluster of villages was one of those. And that example also leads us to another one, which I think is in one way quite a mind shift, which is that the boundaries of decision making that we have right now, the current political boundaries of decision making, whether they're within countries or between countries, need to be questioned from an ecological and cultural standpoint. Are they ecologically relevant? Are they culturally relevant? Or are they actually accidents of history where a line has been drawn between what were contiguous ecologies and contiguous cultures? Certainly in the South Asian context, that is the case, where contiguous ecosystems and cultures or spaces of transhuman trans-ecosystem movement have been cut by the India-Pakistan border, the India-China border, the India-Bangladesh border, etc. You find that at least we need to start questioning those sorts of boundaries to see whether in fact we have to reimagine political decision making based on ecosystems and cultures. I'm leaving it at that right now. In the discussion we can go into this in more detail. The second crucial ingredient is economics. Now I've used a bit of wordplay here, which is a combination of English and Hindi or Sanskrit, which is Arthashastra is economics in Hindi. So a little bit of a punning there. The phrase economics as if the earth mattered or economics as if people mattered comes from a Gandhian economist called Kumarappa, which, well, I don't have the name here, but I'll give it to you later if you want, which essentially was about Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi actually never wrote economics, but a lot of what he wrote has elements of economics in it. So what Kumarappa as an economist did was to pick out those elements and say what would be a Gandhian economics. He has a very interesting book, which is Economics as the Economics of Permanence. A few examples of where people have tried to do things differently from the current system in which it's either the state or capitalists who are taking the economic decisions or who have control over the means of production. And processes in which, because of this and because of a number of other factors, we see this massive rural-urban migration. It's a global phenomenon in India. It is predicted that within the next 15 to 20 years, 50% of India will be in cities. Of course, in Europe, you've already reached and gone well beyond that. But in India, it's still a process underway. Now, already our cities are groaning and creaking. If any of you has been to any of the Indian big cities, you will know that. So another 25% of India's population actually moving into cities is a huge nightmare. So here are a few places where in fact the process has been reversed, where because through a whole series of rural revitalization programs led by the villagers themselves, especially with things like water and other natural resources, local livelihoods, dealing with social inequalities, and I'll come back to that in a minute. These villages have become vibrant economic and social spaces, and people who had actually earlier moved out into cities have moved back. Many families have actually come back, or outmigration has significantly reduced and been stopped. Another very interesting process is where producers are challenging the economic system and saying, why should we be the ones who are worst off in the economic sector, where all the profits or the revenues are gained by traders or by retailers or by the final value-added producers, and not by us as primary producers. So the attempt is to actually create cooperatives and companies which are run by the producers themselves on democratic lines, in which they actually try and gain control over the entire chain from the production to the retail. This is an interesting example of textiles from Western India, some of the most beautiful textiles in the country, where about 2,000 or 3,000 women run these cooperatives and companies and are able to gain much better livelihoods through that. This is an example of a state government initiative, just to also say that governments can also sometimes get it right, which is an enterprise that actually supports about 300,000 families for upgrading their traditional skills on crafts: metal, cane, bamboo, silk, handlooms, painting, singing, drawing, etc. And helping them with small inputs like raw materials if they're not available, better machinery, handlooms for instance, and then marketing. So that entire chain of, again, economic activity increasingly managed by the producers themselves through state support. And finally, an example from a city. This is the city I live in, where about 4,000 or 5,000 women who have worked in traditionally very degrading and socially ostracized occupations like waste collection have enhanced their social status and economic status through unionizing, through negotiating with the state, with the city administration, and with households for everything from segregation of waste to much better health conditions, much better conditions of dealing with the waste, much better revenues from selling the waste or recycling it, and things like that. So again, just a few examples which point to a different economics. One, of course, part of that is clearly that of being mindful of planetary limits. But the other, I think, really crucial one, and this is especially important in the context of the economic globalization that we are going through in India, and which the whole world is going through, of course, is the economic localization, which is not to say that everything is produced locally in a village, but to say that at least for basic needs, which is not just basic needs, basic physical needs, but also things like health and education, etc., that can be something in which the local cluster of villages or villages and a town can be self-sufficient. You don't need to depend on somebody 3,000 kilometers away for your water or for your energy or whatever. So that is, with localization, the control over the means of production, and of course consumer movements, consumption, the move towards actually even dissolving this artificial distinction that we've created between producers and consumers. So, you know, you're a farmer, you're a producer, I eat it, so I'm a consumer. But in fact, actually beginning to see how we may be both. Not that I also become a farmer, but that I'm producing something else which you are using, and so therefore we're actually all becoming prosumers. The idea of local currencies and non-monetized exchanges. India has traditionally had a very strong barter system, which is it's on the decline. Of course, it's also been socially exploitative, but we can actually reimagine, recreate it in a different new context to see how do we move ourselves away from this really hegemony of money that is on all our minds, and which is the one that actually creates enormous problems, including financial corruption, which is, of course, as you know, very big in India. And finally, of course, moving beyond our current indicators of what is wealth and progress and prosperity, especially GDP, which is a completely meaningless, totally nonsensical indicator for any kind of progress. But looking at, for instance, things like basic needs, does the entire population actually have basic needs? Are we satisfied? Are we happy? Do we have good social relationships? And so on and so forth. So that's the second ingredient. How am I doing on time? 15 minutes? Okay. The third ingredient is justice. And this is absolutely important in the context of India, because as you, most of you know about the caste system. Are you all aware of the caste system? Okay, just quickly, basically in India, you're born into a caste, which is a social status, and there's a strong hierarchy of castes. So if you're born into the priest or the educated class, you're the highest caste. Sorry, you're the highest. If you're, so there's various different gradations that you have. And 200 million or 250 million Indians are actually not even in the caste system. They're so-called outcasts, which is that because they used to be doing the work that was considered most degrading, like cleaning our toilets and things like that, or working with leather. And so issues of social justice, which are class, gender, caste, etc., are absolutely crucial. A couple of examples to show how people have tried to deal with them. This is a very, very interesting example of small women farmers who are Dalits. So Dalits are this so-called outcasts that I just mentioned. Over the last about 30 years, they've completely transformed their lives through reviving traditional forms of agriculture, going completely organic, bringing back into production some 80 different kinds of varieties of seeds, millets and pulses and so on. Linking this to a local marketing system, which is in their own villages and in nearby town. Securing or trying to secure land rights for women, which again is very unusual in a country like India. And many other such things. Through this, and also then through becoming good at communications, they run their own filmmaking studio, they run their own community radio, which goes to 200, 300 villages. They run their own school because they believe that the government school is really bad, which is true. And many other such things. They have not just transformed their food situation, they're food sovereign now, whereas earlier they in fact had food scarcity, but also their social status as Dalits. So their caste status is much better now. They're actually not looked down upon. In fact, the so-called upper castes come to them and ask them for advice on things like, sustainability of agriculture. As women, their status is much, much more equal than used to be the case, and so on. It's a long story which I'm cutting short. So that's one way of dealing with the inequalities or injustices. In cities, we see similar processes. This is a town called Bhuj in Western India, where the poor, the colonies of the poor, the so-called squatters or slums, have mobilized themselves with the help of local NGOs to provide themselves with decentralized water supply. They're now 100% water self-sufficient, much better housing using local materials, claiming land rights on which they have squatted, and many other such processes, basically becoming also part of deciding what the city should be. Similar to, I think, Stavros, what he was saying, as to actually becoming creators of, or in some senses, sort of definers of the city. So that's the third ingredient, which is really about justice. Fourth is knowledge and cultures. Now, in India, this is again absolutely crucial because, well, everywhere else, but certainly in India, if you look at it, the cultural diversity of the country is just incredible. We recently had a people's survey of languages in India, which came up with existing living languages in India being about 800. These are not dialects, these are independent living languages. 300 or so have already died out, but there's still 800 left. Similarly with food, and so on. So the cultural diversity, and with that, of course, the knowledge diversity is really crucial. Now, one big challenge we have here is our education system. Essentially, our education system is geared towards creating people who will fit into the current economic and political system, right? The capitalist system or the state-dominated systems. And so it's exactly, you know, producing what Pete Seeger had called little boxes. Anybody here heard Pete Seeger's song, Little Boxes, the American folk singer? It's, yeah, so you're just creating little boxes to fit into the system. The only difference might be one is blue, one is red, etc. So, but otherwise they're all, so that's what our education system is. So here are a few attempts at actually trying to create a learning or an educational system which is truly alternative, which is actually trying to, first of all, instill faith and, confidence and amongst the children of their own cultures, their own ecological roots, their own cultural roots, their own historical roots. And while learning, there are things that are coming from outside, not lose sight of those roots. So they're actually much more rooted than is the case otherwise. If you otherwise look at it in local communities in India, the education system is tending to take them away. They're tending to say you're primitive, your languages are of no use, you need to learn English, etc., and are alienating them from their own roots. But that's not to say that they remain there in those situations. We also have, in all of these examples, you're also being able to, you are also exposed to the outside world. You're learning what things are learning outside. And it's that combination of traditional and modern, local and outside, formal and informal. So the teachers are not only the PhDs, but also the local village expert who's very good at, say, identifying plants in the forest, or who's very good at farming. He's also a teacher in that school. So it's a very different way of trying to actually create an educational system. And finally, of course, in ways of knowledge and knowing is about technologies. It's about the production of knowledge, which needs to become far more, traditionally was, but needs to become far more democratic. It's not just about a few expert institutions who are creating that knowledge and then everybody has to follow that. But everybody, all of us, are actually repositories of skills and knowledge. And that democratic process of creating it, again, examples where much more ecologically friendly and much more people accessible technologies are created through these kinds of processes in India. So that last ingredient, therefore, is again a whole lot of different things relating to knowledge and culture and technologies. And I don't have the time to go into all of this right now, but basically, let me just also flag the last one, which I haven't spoken about, which is really, again, being able to not just relate to each other in ways that are ethical, which are crucial, not just economic relationships, but also ethical, social relationships, but also go deeper into oneself. And of course, in India, there's lots of old traditions of that. But there are dangers to that, which maybe we can speak about later, especially in the current context of the government right now, which is trying to essentially say that India is a Hindu society. So Hinduism as a religion is kind of becoming dominant. So there are two sort of two sides to the sword here, and we can discuss that later. Okay, so all these four ingredients put together, the dish that we're coming up with is what we've called in this book Radical Ecological Democracy. An Indian term for that is Harit Swaraj or Eco Swaraj. The word Swaraj is something that Gandhi used a lot, but it of course predates him. And it's unfortunately got corrupted into meaning independent country. So India seeking independence from Britain as a colonial power. But actually Swaraj is everything from the freedom of the individual to the freedom of people and humanity as such. And it's a very deep concept, which again we can go into in the discussion. But essentially what radical ecological democracy is, very simply put, a process of decision making, a process of relating to each other in which we are all part of this. We all share the power to do this, but we do it in ways that are ecologically and socially responsible, ecologically sustainable, socially sensitive, equitable, etc., etc. And the most crucial part of this is that we then are putting our faith, so to speak, not in the state, nor in corporations, but in the community. And I take very well what Stavros has said. The community is not just what has been determined through history as like the village community or whatever, but it can be continuously evolving. It's a self-defined process of or units of identity in some way. But so it is in fact that ordinary person, all of us, who actually become the locus of power, not the state nor the corporation. Let me end by, just quickly also, okay, I'll come back to this in a minute. Yeah. Yeah, as I said, India, of course, without spices, Indian food would be useless. So to me, actually, the most important part of all of this is not that you can actually replicate one example that I've given here and put it somewhere else. This is the mistake that a lot of NGOs and, of course, governments make, that you find something nice happening and, okay, let's do it all over the world. It's actually more about learning what values are coming out of, what principles are arising from these examples that people are talking about or doing. And I've just listed here a few. I'm sure many more could be listed, and I'm not going to go into each of these in detail. We can maybe put this up again later if you're interested. But to my mind, this is a set of values and principles which runs completely contradictory and counter to the currently dominant systems. Just to take one example, if you look at number 3, cooperation, solidarity in the commons, it's totally different from what we are taught in school these days, at least again in India, where my main goal in life after I leave school and college should be to become rich, powerful, and famous. If possible, all 3, but at least one of these. Whereas in fact here it says, no, I mean, your goal in life is not that. It's about actually relating to other people, about trying to see how humanity as a whole, or your community as a whole, or your class as a whole, and other species also, of course, are able to evolve, become more prosperous, not in an economic sense, but in terms of what we hold dear in our lives. So I'm going to leave it at this. Just quickly to go back and tell you about a couple of processes that we're doing, which are trying to spread this through other parts of India. We have something called the Vikalp Sangam, which is an alternatives confluence. As you probably know, a confluence of rivers in India has always been a very sacred spot. Similarly, this is a confluence of ideas, opinions, initiatives, experiences, disputes, debates, dialogues amongst people who are involved with these sorts of grassroots experimentation or with conceptualizing them. And we're trying to bring them together in different parts of India and hopefully eventually at a national scale. The other thing we're doing is we realize that there is no single place in which we can actually find all these different initiatives. So we have started a website last year. Please visit that. I always tell people that if you're ever feeling depressed when you read the morning newspapers, please visit this website. It will cheer you up because there's lots of fantastic stuff happening. And of course, this is just India. There's, again, lots elsewhere. And that becomes really crucial also, is the attempt to actually try and do more things like this, where we learn from each other, where similar initiatives happening in other parts of the world could teach us, where what we are doing could maybe give inputs to others. So I've just put a few examples here. All of them, in some way or the other, none of them perfect, but things one can learn from. And that brings me to the last point, which is when we speak against economic globalization, people say, are you then against globalization? And the response is no. It's a different form of globalization that we need. It's this kind of stuff. It's the exchange of ideas, initiatives, cultures, even materials, but in ways that are not dominated by the current financial, economic powers or political powers, but where it's a people-to-people exchange, community-to-community exchange. And we need much more of that. Just going to put up a few points here, my own questions for dialogue and discussion, where I think I certainly need much more inputs. That's a few. I'm sure there are many more. And the last one I think is really important. Even if we agree on some future visions of this kind, how do we get there and who is going to do it? Is it going to be academics and students, trade unions, people's movements? What does that mean? What kind of people's movements? Political parties? Who is going to be leading this pathway to change? Thank you. There's some more stuff on the website. So.
Okay, thank you, Ashish. So we have we're going to focus now on questions of clarification. So if you have a in-depth kind of comments, please, we'll get to those after the coffee break. Check.
Hi, thank you, Ashish. I just want to point out 2 points relative to two of the images that you used. The first one is related to economic. If you can put again, please, because this is very important. I will never use that kind of comics because it's really ethics, and we need politics when we speak about the problems of economic growth. The one that you have with the boat, we are all in the same boat. This is a very ethical point of criticizing the growth economics. But if you want to use it, you should use then also another one in which we are in the boat and the people in power are flying over us with airplanes.
Oh,
Otherwise, we just raise real ethical critiques of the economic growth. So we lose the political that is very important in fighting against economic growth ideas. We are not in the same boat. There are people that are flying over us. First point. The second point is about the picture that you used to show the common, the villages. If you can put a little bit, because it's very important also to me to look at it.
Sorry, which one?
The one where there is a circle of people speaking to each other. Is the villages that one on the top? Yeah. Yeah, this one. That according to me, there is a clear order in which, even if you can speak about, you know, a process of consensus, the order that it's clear to me. No, there are men on one side and a woman on another side already speak about the powerless or powerful discourses that can raise in a consensus process. I mean, from this order, the voices are different. So I want to use this because it's very important, the example of Stavros about the fact that the people that have a power in a context like the academics, supposedly they have a power of using words and so on and so forth. So I'm really keen on this idea of the anthropology of absence. So the capacity of being able to shut down himself. But I'm really concerned in the assemblies, not as a powerful person, but with the powerless people. I mean, the people that cannot speak because they are not able to do that. So I think that one of the things that we have to reflect a little bit more is about, is the commons vision that we have in the future only a process in which we will have consensus, or we really think that sometimes the votes are very important? Let's think that I think, for example, that the secret vote is a very important process that we have in our culture, because the secret vote is for the people that are not powerful, but often powerless. They are under-treated for different reasons. So I think we have, let's say, reflect a little bit about the commons, the process of consensus, and also how it relates to the legitimation of vote in some context.
Okay. Should I respond to these now? I think the second question is a very interesting and maybe a complex one, so we can come back to that after the break. Just a quick one on the first one about being in the same boat. Yeah, I mean, I agree and disagree. I mean, I think in one sense, yes, those guys are, or all of us are actually up there in the air. But in another sense, we're all doomed, including those who are currently in power. So I think the cartoonist was kind of using it in the second sense, saying that we need, even those who are currently in power need to recognize somewhere or the other, I mean, they may or may not. I mean, I don't know if somebody sitting up on the 26th floor will suddenly have a brainwave, but need to recognize that ultimately, I mean, the whole earth is threatened by what we're doing right now. So it's both. I mean, in the sense that currently, yeah, I mean, those who are flying around are not imperiled in the same way that poor people are, but ultimately, all of us are. So.
Thanks, Ashish. I just want to ask a question in relation to the way you position values and principles. You mentioned, you said these are the spices, and spices depends on taste. Whereas I would take it as one of the key ingredients, because values and principles will drive the transformative process. And so I would like you comment on that.
Okay, clearly my presentation has a lot of allegories and images which could be problematic. Yeah, I think put in that way, I would probably agree with you. But ingredients also depends on choices. In India, you can make a kadhi, I don't know if you saw, virtually any dish with different ingredients also. So it's a little bit of a, I mean, if you look at the generic dishes, that you can. Like a dosa, I mean, a South Indian dosa, how many people have had? You can actually make a dosa with rice, you can make it with pulses, you can make it with millets. And what spices you put in also then will depend on taste. So maybe one shouldn't get too bogged down by the imagery that I've used. Or if somebody is interested in helping me with better imagery, I'd be very happy to do that. But your main point that you're making is absolutely right, that the values are at the base in some sense, the fundamentals of what we do. And in that sense, maybe one should say that, I mean, okay, so in some way or the other, it is an absolutely essential ingredient of, so maybe let's say it's the energy. For all cooking, you need some energy, right? I mean, some form, maybe whether it's solar or gas or whatever. So it is actually, in that sense, the energy which is required for. But the only thing that I think we need to add here, and maybe we can do that in discussion on the values, is this question which I don't know, I'm not clear about myself yet, is that do we actually need that whole, for any initiative to be successful or for a transformation to happen, do we actually need that whole set of values? Can we make do with some? Are some more important, some less important, etc.? And I'm not clear in my own head on that, so I think that would be interesting. Over the last few years, one of the processes that we've used, and there's a document out there which if you're interested in, which is called a Framework Conceptual Note on Alternatives, which is evolving through these confluences that we are doing, where people are actually adding to the list of values. So even from having started with 6 or 7 in the beginning, we already now have, I think, more than a dozen. And that's a very interesting discussion and dialogue, because people hold different values dear to their heart. What your values you hold might be slightly different from the ones I hold. But so do we have a set that's common, and then beyond that, there are some more that you feel are important, I don't feel they're important. It's a discussion dialogue, I think, that we need to have. And then if you do it between cultures, then it becomes that much more complex, but that much more fascinating.
Okay, so Eric, the other thing is we have 1.5 hours after the coffee. So maybe if there's things that are more, unless it's a specific thing about the presentation, we can enter into more discussion after. Okay. So should we maybe have a coffee break now and then come back and continue? So just a quick announcement, I think, before we go.
Yeah, just to say that we will stay in this room after the coffee break, but then after lunch we will move to another room. So that's basically once you move up to the big square with the lawn, you move right across it, so basically opposite to where we are. And there's a building with a canteen at the bottom, and we're in the level floor, so there will be a sign. It's called Özger Arnas.